The courtroom is suffocating with tension. The cold, sterile atmosphere makes Malcolm's heart race, but he keeps his gaze steady. His lawyer's words echo in his head, reminding him to stay composed. But no matter how calm he tries to appear, the world outside the courtroom has already judged him. Malcolm Carter, a 16-year-old black teenager, stands before the judge, trying to hold his ground. He wears a simple white shirt, his clothes too plain for the high-end store he's accused of stealing from. His shoes are scuffed, a far cry from the expensive designer brands that have always seemed so out of reach. But it's not the clothes or the evidence that bothers him. It's the way people look at him, the way they always have. In his neighborhood, they were taught to survive. That was all that mattered. No one ever cared about the dreams he had or the future he hoped for. To the world, he was just another black kid from a broken home. To them, his life didn't count. Judge Harrison, sitting high above the courtroom, stares down at Malcolm like he's seen too many kids like him. His steely gray eyes seem to judge Malcolm before he even opens his mouth. Malcolm Carter, accused of shoplifting from a high-end store. The judge's voice carries a weight that makes Malcolm's chest tighten. The evidence against you is clear. Blurred camera footage of a black male in a hoodie. How do you plead? Malcolm stays silent for a moment. His lawyer's voice is a faint hum in his ear, but he already knows what's coming. They won't believe him, no matter how hard he tries to explain. It's all too familiar. Guilty, the judge declares without waiting for Malcolm's response. People like you never take responsibility for their actions. You all think you're above the law. The words cut deeper than any accusation could. You people. The phrase stings, reminding Malcolm of the prejudices he faces every day. He clenches his fists, forcing himself to stay calm. This isn't the time to lose control. His lawyer speaks up, but it's already too late. The judge's mind is made up. I've heard enough, Judge Harrison snaps. You can't keep blaming society for your problems. Every single one of you has the same story. No family, no future. The words burn through the air, each one punctuated with judgment. Malcolm wants to speak out, to defend himself, but every time he opens his mouth, the judge silences him with a wave of his hand. He's been dismissed before, his voice never heard. So, instead, he stands there, fighting against the weight of the world that's stacked against him. The murmurs in the courtroom rise. Some of the faces in the audience look sympathetic, others indifferent. The judge's words have a way of commanding the room, his authority hanging like a heavy curtain. Malcolm feels small, but he refuses to let it show. He's heard these words before, but this time it's different. This time he's fighting back, even if only in his mind. He's not just a black boy. He's not just a statistic or a stereotype. He's a person, a teenager with dreams, with aspirations, and he's not going to let anyone take that from him. Have you ever been judged unfairly? What did you do to stand up for yourself? Share your thoughts in the comments. The courtroom was silent, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. Judge Harrison leaned forward, his cold gaze piercing through Malcolm like a laser. You think you can fool me, the judge sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. Look at you, no future, no discipline. You're just another statistic waiting to happen. Malcolm's fingers clenched into fists, his nails digging into his palms. The words stung, but he refused to let the anger bubble to the surface. He had been here before, had been judged too many times. But today, he wasn't going to let anyone dictate his worth. His court-appointed lawyer, a nervous man with glasses too large for his face, tried to offer a defense, but his words fell flat. "Your Honor, my client's record is—" The judge raised a hand, silencing him instantly. "This case is open and shut," Judge Harrison interrupted, "and I intend to make an example out of you." The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. The audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some glancing at Malcolm with a mix of sympathy and discomfort. Even they could tell this wasn't right, but no one dared to speak up. "You have no education, no prospects," Judge Harrison continued, his voice growing sharper. "I don't even know why we're wasting time on you." Malcolm's eyes remained fixed on the judge, his gaze unwavering. He took a slow breath, focusing on the weight of the moment. He was used to this, used to people thinking they knew who he was just by looking at him. But they had no idea. They had no clue what he had overcome, what he was capable of. The words came, slow and deliberate, from Malcolm's lips. "Your Honor, I'm not what you think I am." His voice was steady, calm in the face of the storm that raged around him. The judge scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Really? And what exactly are you? You're just another product of this broken system, another young man with no chance at a decent life." Malcolm leaned forward, his voice carrying a quiet strength. "You're wrong about me, and I'll prove it." The judge chuckled, a bitter sound. "Oh, really? How do you plan on doing that?" "I may not have an education," Malcolm said, his voice rising just enough to make sure the whole room heard him, "but I have something much more valuable: resilience, the will to fight, and the desire to prove everyone wrong." The courtroom fell dead silent. The air seemed to still. Judge Harrison's smug expression faltered for a split second, but only for a moment. He quickly regained his composure. "You think those qualities are enough to turn your life around?" the judge asked with disdain. "You think your little speech is going to change anything?" Malcolm didn't flinch. "No, Your Honor," he said with a sense of finality, "but I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you and everyone else that I'm not just another statistic. I'm not who you think I am. I'm more." The judge paused, his gaze narrowing as he studied Malcolm. For a moment, it was as though time itself stood still. Then the judge leaned back in his chair, the skepticism returning to his face. "Then prove it, Mr. Williams. Prove me wrong." Malcolm stood tall. He wasn't going to let Judge Harrison's words define him. He was going to fight, for himself, for the future that no one else believed he deserved. And he would win, not just for the sake of his own dignity, but for the dignity of every person who had ever been judged before their time. The room held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Have you ever had to prove someone wrong about you? Share your thoughts in the comments. The courtroom was tense, and all eyes were on Malcolm as he stepped up, his voice steady but laced with authority. The walls seemed to close in as the judge's skeptical gaze sharpened. "Actually, Your Honor, I'm more qualified to argue this case than you think," Malcolm said, his words calm but laden with intent. Judge Harrison let out a dismissive scoff, clearly unimpressed. "Oh, so you think you're a lawyer now?" Malcolm didn't flinch. "Actually, I am," he replied, a glimmer of confidence in his eyes. "I've been studying law since I was 12. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. The judge's face faltered for a split second, clearly caught off guard by the revelation. The audience exchanged glances, whispers darting around like wildfire. Here was a kid, no older than 16, making claims that would have sounded absurd moments ago, but now They seemed plausible. "That's a bit hard to believe," Judge Harrison retorted, leaning back in his chair, trying to regain control. "How do you suppose that helps your case?" Malcolm stepped forward, his eyes never leaving the judge's face. "Your Honor, according to case law, an accusation without direct evidence is inadmissible in court. That means this case has no legal standing," he said, his voice unwavering. The courtroom fell silent. Even the murmurs had stopped. The judge blinked, momentarily thrown off. This was not the argument he had anticipated. Malcolm, a teenager with no formal legal training, had just spoken like a seasoned lawyer. His words were not just insightful, they were grounded in legal theory. The judge, visibly irritated, cleared his throat. "You expect me to just accept your word for it, young man?" "No, Your Honor," Malcolm replied, his smirk small but determined. "But you can check the case law for yourself. You know as well as I do that you can't proceed with a conviction without solid evidence." Malcolm wasn't finished yet. "In fact," he continued, pacing slightly as he gathered his thoughts, "the security footage isn't enough for a conviction. You need an eyewitness, which you don't have." The judge's face soured as the words sank in. He knew Malcolm was right, but his pride wouldn't let him admit it. Instead, he shifted in his seat, visibly trying to compose himself. "So, what do you expect me to do with this? You want to dismiss the case based on one teenager's opinion." His voice was tight, defensive. Malcolm met his gaze without hesitation. "It's not just my opinion. It's the law. I'm just the one who has the courage to point it out." The judge opened his mouth, but no words came out. He glared at Malcolm, then at the security footage on the screen behind him. The courtroom had fallen deathly silent, the tension almost unbearable. The judge knew that the foundation of his case was shaky, but he wouldn't give in so easily. As the silence stretched, Malcolm stood tall, waiting. The audience was stunned. They had expected a young kid, maybe frightened, maybe unsure. But what they had gotten was someone who knew exactly what he was talking about. The realization was sinking in. Malcolm was not just a kid in the defendant's seat. He was a force to be reckoned with. The judge sighed, his eyes narrowing. "I'll take a recess," he muttered, clearly agitated. "We'll reconvene in 10 minutes. As he turned to leave the bench, Malcolm stood still, a small smile playing at the edges of his lips. His words had carried weight. For the first time, the courtroom felt like a battleground where the odds had just shifted in his favor. As the courtroom filed out, the whispers grew louder. The judge's authority had been questioned not by an adult lawyer, but by a kid who knew his stuff. Malcolm had shocked everyone, and now the whole room was waiting to see what would happen next. The question lingered in the air. Would the judge admit his mistake, or would he continue to press forward with a case that had been built on shaky ground? Have you ever seen someone underestimated, only to shock everyone? "Let's talk." Malcolm stood in the courtroom, his hands shaking slightly, but his resolve stronger than ever. The whispers in the room had been growing louder since the moment he had entered, the atmosphere thick with judgment. They had all assumed the worst of him, based solely on his appearance and his background. He wasn't just fighting for his innocence. He was fighting to prove that they had underestimated him. The judge had already made his conclusions, and the courtroom had made up its mind. Malcolm had been accused of a crime he didn't commit. The prosecutor had painted him as the villain, pointing to his history, his neighborhood, and his perceived threats. But today, Malcolm wasn't backing down. Today, He had the one thing that mattered: the truth. As the prosecutor spoke, accusing him again and again, Malcolm's lawyer had sat silently, seemingly unable to break through the flood of prejudice and assumptions. That was until Malcolm had enough. He leaned forward in his seat, his voice breaking through the noise. "I have something to say," Malcolm said, his eyes locking with the judge. The room went quiet. Even the prosecutor paused, glancing toward Malcolm, unsure of what he was about to present. Malcolm pulled a small USB drive from his pocket and handed it to his lawyer. "If the court is so sure I did it, I'd like to present evidence proving my innocence." His lawyer hesitated, but eventually walked over to the projector, inserting the USB into the machine. The screen flickered as the footage began to play. The room went silent again, this time in a different way. On the screen, clear, high-quality footage from a nearby security camera played. A tall, bearded man wearing a gray hoodie could be seen stuffing items into his bag at the very store Malcolm was accused of stealing from. The footage showed him clearly, his face fully visible, as he took what wasn't his. Malcolm wasn't even in the store at the time the crime took place. In fact, he could be seen walking by the store much later, long after the thief had left. Gasps filled the room. The jury exchanged stunned looks, and even Malcolm's lawyer appeared to be speechless. The prosecutor's face flushed with frustration, his accusations unraveling in real time. The judge's expression darkened with anger as he slammed his gavel down. "Where did you get this?" Judge Harrison's voice was tight, almost furious. Malcolm stood tall, his voice steady despite the chaos in the room. "It's called research. I tracked down security footage from a camera across the street. It clearly shows the real thief leaving the store minutes before I even walked by." The courtroom erupted with murmurs, disbelief and shock sweeping through every corner. The case that had seemed so solid was now a house of cards, crumbling before their eyes. The prosecution's case was in ruins, the jury's confidence shattered. Even the judge, usually unshakable in his decisions, had no response to what he was seeing. Malcolm's lawyer turned to him, eyes wide with astonishment. He hadn't believed Malcolm's claims at first, but now he had no choice but to acknowledge the truth. The judge's face turned a deep shade of red, his grip tightening on his gavel. "Case dismissed," he said, his voice barely audible. But the finality of his words carried the weight of a lifetime of mistakes and misconceptions. Malcolm exhaled, his body releasing the tension that had been building since this nightmare began. He had done it. The truth had been revealed, and his name was cleared. But before he could leave the courtroom, he turned back to the judge, his voice calm but unwavering. "You judged me before you even knew the facts," Malcolm said, his words carrying across the silent courtroom. "You assumed I was guilty because of how I look. But today, I proved something important. You can't silence the truth." As those words hung in the air, the courtroom erupted into applause. For the first time in a long time, Malcolm felt the power of justice on his side. He had proven them all wrong, and in that moment, he knew that the truth had won. In a world that often overlooked people like him, Malcolm had found a way to stand tall. He had proven that, no matter where you came from, the truth would always prevail. And in that moment, he knew he would never be silenced again. Outside the courthouse, the sound of flashing cameras and rapid footsteps filled the air as reporters rushed toward Malcolm. He had just left the courtroom, having won a case that no one thought a kid could win. One of the reporters, microphone in hand, thrust it toward him. "Malcolm, how did you know how to defend yourself so well?" Malcolm, his face calm yet confident, replied, "I read, I study, I learn." He smiled, his eyes filled with an intensity that seemed well beyond his years. "I want to be a lawyer one day, and now I know I will be." His words echoed in the crowd of onlookers. This wasn't just a victory for Malcolm. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been underestimated, for anyone who had ever been told they couldn't achieve their dreams. He had made his mark, and it was clear that the world was beginning to take notice. A week later, news outlets across the country were covering his story. Social media buzzed with admiration for the young genius who had stood tall against a corrupt system. People marveled at how, at just 12 years old, he had navigated the intricacies of law with more skill and determination than many seasoned professionals. One of the top news stations interviewed him again, asking about his future. "They tried to silence me," Malcolm said, his voice steady, but the fire of justice burning bright in his eyes. "But the truth has a way of speaking louder than any judge." As his story spread, opportunities began pouring in. A prestigious law firm reached out, offering him an internship once he was old enough to work. They wanted to help shape his future, to mentor him into the legal mind they knew he could become. But the biggest surprise came a few days later. An Ivy League university, one of the most respected in the country, sent a letter addressed to him and his grandmother. They were offering Malcolm a full scholarship, a chance to attend their institution when the time came, to learn from the best, and eventually graduate as a lawyer. The letter was framed and hung proudly on the wall of Malcolm's home. He never dreamed that this was possible, but now the path to his future was clear. Malcolm had defied expectations. He had risen above every obstacle thrown his way. And now he had a future ahead of him that was nothing short of brilliant. "They tried to silence me," Malcolm said again, this time during a live interview. "But the truth has a way of speaking louder than any judge." His voice was resolute, full of the wisdom of someone who had already faced more challenges than most adults would in a lifetime. He was no longer just a boy from the wrong side of town. Malcolm had become a beacon of hope for anyone who had ever felt small or unheard, and he knew, with every ounce of his being, that he was destined for greatness. The world had seen him, and now they would never forget him. The boy they tried to condemn was now a legal genius, ready to take on the world. His story was just beginning, and the world would soon know that Malcolm had arrived.